The reception was held in the West Hall of the law school. High ceilings, marble floors, quiet confidence in the room. I arrived early, like I always do. Old habit. My daughter, Claire, was greeting classmates near the windows. Proud, nervous, trying not to show either. I stood back and watched her for a moment. That's when a man in a dark suit approached me. Mid-40s, tight smile, clipboard in hand. He didn't ask my name. Catering staff goes through the kitchen, he said, pointing down a side corridor. Late setup. I looked at him, then at my coat, then back at him. I could have corrected him. Instead, I nodded once and said, "Of course." The kitchen door swung open into heat and noise. Steel counters, trays stacked high. A woman loading glasses glanced at me and froze. "Oh, sorry," she whispered. Before I could respond, a louder voice cut in from behind. "Can you keep that cleaning lady away from the guests?" That came from a tall man near the bar. Gray hair, confident posture. His name tag read, Martin Hale. He was standing beside a younger man, Claire's boyfriend, Ethan. Ethan didn't look at me. Martin laughed lightly, like this was all very reasonable. "Important night," he added. "Standards matter." I felt something settle then. Not anger, clarity. I adjusted my sleeves and stepped fully into the kitchen, because once someone shows you how they see you, the smartest move is to let them keep talking, especially in a room full of people who believe power is always visible. If you've ever been underestimated in a room like this, stay with me, because what they said next changed everything. I stayed in the kitchen longer than I needed to, long enough to understand how the night was organized, who gave orders, who followed them without question. The catering manager, Rosa, handed me a tray without asking. Her eyes said she knew something was wrong. Her mouth stayed quiet. I didn't correct her. I listened. Servers talked when they thought no one important was around. About donors. About professors. About which families expected special treatment. One name came up more than once. Martin Hale. "He paid for the bar upgrade," someone said. "That's why he's acting like he owns the place." Another voice laughed. "He basically does." I carried glasses through the side doors and into the hall. No one stopped me. Invisibility has advantages. Near the podium, Martin was holding court, telling a story too loudly. Ethan stood beside him, nodding when appropriate. Claire hovered nearby, smiling politely, eyes scanning the room. She saw me once. Just once. Her smile faltered. Then she looked away. I understood why. I passed behind Martin as he spoke. He didn't notice me. "That girl's lucky," he said, gesturing toward Claire. "Good school. Good connections. We'll straighten her out." People laughed. I kept walking. By the time I reached the service station, I knew exactly who Martin was. Not powerful. Not important. Just used to rooms where no one challenged him. And I knew something else. He believed the kitchen was a place where people didn't hear anything. That belief was going to cost him. I set the tray down and stepped back against the wall. From there, I could see most of the room, the podium, the bar, the clusters of parents pretending not to compare resumes. Rosa passed me again. She leaned in slightly and said, "You don't belong back here." I met her eyes and smiled. "I know." She hesitated, then nodded once and walked away. Near the windows, Professor Langford was speaking to a small group. Admissions committee, faculty leadership, the people who mattered. Martin drifted toward them like it was inevitable. He shook hands too hard, laughed too long. "I always say," Martin announced, "law schools should teach confidence first. The rest follows." Professor Langford smiled politely, didn't respond. Martin kept talking anyway. He bragged about his firm, about judges he knew, about how rules bent when the right families were involved. Each sentence was louder than the last. Ethan watched him with admiration. Claire watched the floor. I adjusted the tray in my hands and moved closer. Just enough. Martin leaned in toward Professor Langford and lowered his voice. "Not enough. I told Ethan," he said. "Merit matters. but influence decides outcomes. That sentence landed heavier than he realized. Professor Langford's expression didn't change, but his eyes shifted toward me. Not with recognition, with attention. I met his gaze for half a second, then looked away, because at that moment, I didn't want to be seen. I wanted to be remembered as the person who heard everything, and Martin was still talking, still confident, still unaware that the room had started listening in a very different way. The first speech began shortly after. A dean stepped up. Applause followed on schedule. I stayed near the back, refilling water glasses no one had asked for. That gave me a reason to move, to pause, to listen. Martin didn't lower his voice this time. He spoke through the speech, leaning toward two men in expensive suits. I caught pieces as I passed. Donations smooth things out. Kids with the right last names always land fine. Judges like order. Predictable families. He laughed at his own insight. One of the men glanced at me, uncomfortable. Martin didn't notice. Ethan finally tried to quiet him. "Dad," he murmured. "Maybe later." Martin waved him off. "This is how the world works," he said. "Might as well say it out loud." I stopped near the drinks table and set down my tray. Claire's name came up next. "She'll do well," Martin said. "She's smart enough, and with us behind her, she won't struggle." That one did it. Not because it was cruel, because it was careless. I watched Professor Langford again. This time, he wasn't pretending not to hear. Two other faculty members had turned slightly, not toward Martin, toward the sound. People assume power means being loud. It doesn't. It means knowing when a room has shifted. Martin was still smiling, still talking. He hadn't realized yet that his audience had changed, and that the kitchen door he thought separated importance from irrelevance had quietly stopped meaning anything at all. The dean finished speaking. Applause rose, then settled. People loosened. Conversations spread again. Martin grew bolder. He moved closer to the faculty cluster, drink in hand, voice carrying. "This place does a good job," he said. "But let's be honest, outcomes come from relationships." One professor excused herself. Another checked his phone. Professor Langford stayed. That was deliberate. Martin leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to sound important. "My firm handles sensitive matters," he said. "We know how to make things efficient." Efficient was his favorite word. I passed behind them again. Slower this time. Martin continued. "Regulators, clerks, even judges. They all appreciate stability." Professor Langford finally spoke. "That's an interesting perspective," he said. "Flat, neutral." Martin smiled wider, mistaking interest for approval. "I'm sure you've seen it," he said. "Rules are flexible for the right people." I felt the shift then. Not dramatic, subtle. Professor Langford didn't respond right away. He looked at Martin's glass, then at mine. I was standing close enough now. Close enough for him to hear me breathe. Martin laughed again. Too loud. "You know how it is," he said. "Some families are just protected." Professor Langford nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "They usually are." His tone changed on that word. Protected. I set the tray down beside them. And for the first time that evening, someone important really looked at me. Professor Langford's eyes didn't leave me. Not curious. Assessing. I kept my posture neutral, hands steady. Martin followed his gaze and frowned. "Can we get a refill here?" he asked, impatient. I picked up his empty glass. Didn't rush. "Of course," I said. My voice was calm, measured. That seemed to irritate him. "Make it quick," Martin added. "We're in the middle of a conversation." Professor Langford watched my face as I poured. "Not the drink." Martin leaned back and continued talking, unaware. "I always tell Ethan," he said, "you don't get ahead by following every rule." That was enough. Professor Langford spoke again. "Excuse me," he said to Martin. "Before you continue, may I ask your name?" Martin straightened. "Hale. Martin Hale." Professor Langford nodded. "And you are?" he asked, turning to me. I met his eyes. "Margaret Collins. I said. The room didn't react. Names rarely do that on their own. Professor Langford's expression changed, just slightly. And your role this evening? He asked. I'm here for my daughter, I replied. Claire Collins. There it was. Martin laughed. A quick bark. That's funny, he said. She's with the students. Professor Langford didn't smile. I know, he said. She's one of our strongest. He paused. And you, he said to me, are not catering staff. The sentence landed quietly, but Martin stopped talking. For the first time that night, he realized something important. The room hadn't mistaken me. He had. Martin's smile faded slowly. Not shock. Calculation. He glanced around, looking for confirmation that this was a misunderstanding. No one offered it. Ethan stepped closer. Dad, he said quietly. What's going on? Professor Langford didn't answer him. He addressed Martin. You've been very candid this evening, he said. About influence. About flexibility. Martin laughed again, weaker this time. I was speaking generally. Of course, Professor Langford said. General statements can still be revealing. Two other faculty members had drifted closer. Not intentionally. Instinctively. People moved toward clarity. Professor Langford turned to me. Collins, he said. How long have you been listening? Long enough, I replied. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. Martin's jaw tightened. This is inappropriate, he said. She shouldn't even be back here. Professor Langford nodded. You're right. He gestured toward the hall. This is not a kitchen conversation, he said. It's a public one. He raised his voice slightly. Not enough to shout. Colleagues, he said. I think we should all hear this. The room quieted. Martin opened his mouth, closed it. For the first time, he understood the danger. Not scandal, not accusation. Context. And context, once shared, has a way of correcting people without ever raising its voice. Professor Langford didn't rush. He never did. That comment about judges, he said calmly, looking at Martin. The one about predictability. Martin shifted his weight. I was speaking loosely, he said. You know how receptions are. Professor Langford nodded once. I do. He turned slightly so others could hear. Not a performance. A courtesy. Influence is a serious claim, he continued, especially in rooms connected to the law. Silence, spread, not awkward, focused. Ethan looked between his father and Professor Langford. His face had gone pale. I didn't mean anything improper, Martin said. Too quickly. Professor Langford smiled faintly. That's fortunate, he said, because impropriety has consequences. Someone near the bar stopped mid-sip. Another set a glass down. I felt the room lean in. Professor Langford turned to me again. Collins, he said. You mentioned you were here for your daughter. Yes, I replied. And your profession? He asked. I waited a beat, just long enough. I'm a federal judge, I said. Eastern District. The room didn't gasp. It recalibrated. Martin stared at me. Not angry now, not dismissive, afraid. Because he finally understood something he should have known earlier. Power doesn't announce itself, it observes. And by the time it speaks, it already knows what you've said. No one spoke right away. That silence did more than any reaction could have. Martin tried to recover. He straightened his jacket, smoothed his tie. I think this has gotten blown out of proportion, he said. A familiar line. One he'd probably used before. Professor Langford didn't respond. Instead, he looked around the room. At faculty. At donors. At parents who suddenly looked very interested in the floor. This is a reception celebrating future officers of the court, he said. Words matter here. Martin opened his mouth again, then stopped. Ethan finally spoke. His voice was low. Dad, he said, maybe we should go. That was new. Martin looked at his son, then back at me. I met his eyes calmly. I didn't accuse him, didn't threaten him. I simply stood where I was. Professor Langford turned to one of the deans. I'd like to make a note of this conversation, he said. Informally, for now. Informally. Martin flinched at that word. Because people like him know what comes next. Not punishment. Process, the dean nodded. Around us, conversation resumed slowly, carefully. But Martin didn't rejoin it. He leaned close to Ethan and said something I couldn't hear. Ethan nodded, stiff. As they walked toward the exit, Martin glanced back at me once. Not with anger, with something worse. Recognition. Because now he understood the lesson he taught everyone else for years. The room had never belonged to him. He had just been loud enough to borrow it until someone with real authority let him finish speaking. The reception ended on time. That part mattered to me. No chaos. No escort. No dramatic exit. Martin and Ethan were gone before the last speech finished. Quietly. Quickly. Claire found me near the windows afterward. Her face was tight with questions she didn't ask. I'm proud of you, I said first, because that was the point of the night. She nodded. Once. Professor Langford approached before we left. He didn't apologize. He didn't praise. He simply said, "Thank you for your restraint." Restraint is what people call it when they realize how much worse it could have been. Over the next weeks, I heard small things. Martin stopped attending events like that. Ethan changed firms after graduation. Nothing official. Nothing public. Just adjustment. That's how systems correct themselves. People later asked why I didn't show my credentials sooner. Why I let it go that far. I told them the truth. Because the moment you flash authority, people stop revealing themselves. And I wanted to know exactly who I was dealing with. That night wasn't about embarrassing a man. It was about letting a room hear how power sounds when it assumes no one important is listening. My daughter still talks about the reception sometimes. Not the incident. The feeling. The moment she realized that dignity doesn't raise its voice. It waits. And when it finally speaks, it doesn't need to explain itself at all.